Somewhere over the Persian Gulf, a fleet of American heavy bombers was already airborne. Targets assigned, payloads armed, flight paths locked in. The crews weren't waiting for orders. They had them. And then, with the gap between those aircraft and their targets measured in minutes, every single plane banked away and turned back. Not because the mission failed, because a phone call succeeded. Because in the final moments before one of the most consequential military strikes of this century, a deal materialized out of nowhere. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow bottleneck that keeps roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moving, cracked back open. And now everyone on Earth is trying to figure out what that actually means, how long it lasts, and what the price tag really is. This is the story of those final hours. And what happens in the next 14 days may matter even more than what just happened in the last 14. Let's step back and make sure everyone understands what was actually at stake here. Because the Strait of Hormuz is one of those geographical facts that most people know vaguely but don't truly feel until it stops working. This waterway, barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, is the sole maritime exit for the oil production of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. Under normal conditions, more than 100 vessels transit it every single day. During the weeks of this conflict, that number dropped to roughly 100 ships total across the entire month. Not per day, per month. That is not a slowdown. That is a near total closure of the artery that pumps energy into the circulatory system of the global economy. Countries across Asia and Europe were watching their strategic reserves drain in real time. Gas prices were accelerating. Industrial output was beginning to contract. The signal coming from global commodity markets was alarm, and it was getting louder every day the strait stayed shut. The United States had drawn its position clearly: reopen the waterway or absorb the consequences. A deadline was set. The clock was running. Here is where things stand as of right now. President Trump confirmed a 2-week ceasefire with Iran. The military campaign that was minutes from execution has been suspended, and this didn't happen in a vacuum. Pakistan's prime minister and senior military leadership stepped into the gap as mediators, facilitating back-channel conversations all the way to the final minute. Based on those conversations, Washington agreed to hold the strikes. The condition was not subtle. Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz immediately, completely, and safely. Iran agreed. Now, before we go any further, it's worth being precise about what this agreement is and what it is not. This is not a peace settlement. There are no signed documents. There was no ceremony, no historic handshake broadcast to the world. What exists is a temporary suspension of hostilities, a 2-week pause designed to create enough space for both sides to attempt a more permanent framework. The distinction matters enormously, because a ceasefire and a resolution are two completely different things, and confusing them is how people get blindsided when things fall apart. And speaking of falling apart, within roughly 90 minutes of the ceasefire announcement hitting the wires, missile launches were detected originating from Iranian territory, heading toward Israel. At least one was intercepted near Tel Aviv. The agreement was barely announced before projectiles were already in the air. There are a few ways to read that. The most alarming interpretation is deliberate defiance, that elements of the Iranian government agreed to one thing while other elements did the opposite. But there is a more structurally concerning explanation that analysts are taking seriously. Iran's military command structure has been severely degraded over months of conflict. Targeted strikes eliminated senior commanders. Communication networks were disrupted at multiple levels. Leadership cells were taken out systematically. The result is a chain of command with serious breaks in it. A situation where orders issued at the top do not reliably reach the operational level, and where junior officers controlling weapon systems may be acting on outdated orders, or in some cases on their own judgment entirely. Consider what that actually means. You have individuals with access to ballistic missile infrastructure who may genuinely be unaware that a ceasefire was agreed, or who are aware and have decided it doesn't apply to them. This is not unprecedented in the history of armed conflict. In almost every major ceasefire in the modern era, there is a period of residual fire after the announcement. The Korean War, multiple Middle Eastern conflicts, the end of Vietnam. The declaration happens at the command level. The reality on the ground takes hours, sometimes days, to catch up. The hope is that this is a communication lag rather than deliberate sabotage of the agreement. But the hope is not the same as the certainty. Meanwhile, the situation involving Israel injects additional complexity that makes the ceasefire's durability harder to assess. Israeli ground forces are currently operating inside southern Lebanon, maintaining what they describe as a buffer zone against Hezbollah. The ceasefire framework reportedly covers the conflict between Iran and Israel directly, but Lebanon's involvement is ambiguous at best. Lebanese news outlets are reporting that the agreement does not explicitly address Lebanese territory. If that is accurate, then Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful proxy force, operates in a gray zone where the ceasefire may or may not apply depending on who you ask. And here's the layer beneath that. Israeli leadership reportedly did not want this ceasefire. According to reporting from both Israeli and American media, Prime Minister Netanyahu was actively pressing President Trump to reject any deal and allow the military campaign to continue at full force. He wanted maximum leverage. He wanted the strikes to proceed. On the other side of that internal debate, Vice President Vance, Special Envoy Witkoff, and Jared Kushner were pushing hard in the opposite direction, advocating for accepting the framework and pursuing a negotiated outcome. That is a significant internal fracture inside the U.S.-Israeli-American political triangle, and it tells you a great deal about how fragile this moment actually is and how easily it could have gone the other way. Now let's get into the substance of what Iran actually put on the table, because this is where the real negotiation lives. The United States sent Iran a 15-point proposal. Iran responded with a 10-point counter. Just by the numbers, that sounds like progress. The gap is narrowing. But the content of those 10 points is where the complexity really begins. Iran's first demand is a guarantee that it will not face military attack again. That is not an outlandish opening position for a country that just endured a sustained bombing campaign. Second, Iran wants a permanent end to the conflict, not just a pause. They have effectively walked this back by accepting the 2-week ceasefire, which signals it is more of a long-term goal than a hard precondition. Third, Iran wants Israeli operations in Lebanon to end, which implies a willingness to rein in Hezbollah in exchange for Israeli withdrawal. But that is an entirely separate negotiation with its own timeline and obstacles. The fourth demand is where things get structurally difficult. Iran wants a full lifting of all American sanctions. Not a rollback, not a partial relief package, all of them, accumulated across multiple administrations over many years. That is an enormously heavy ask, and selling it domestically in Washington would be extraordinarily challenging regardless of what any administration wanted to do. Fifth, Iran wants an end to all regional military operations targeting its allied forces, primarily Hezbollah, but potentially extending to proxy networks across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Point 6, and this is critical. In exchange for all of the above, Iran would formally and permanently reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And then there is point 7, which stopped a lot of people in their tracks when it emerged. Iran is proposing a fee of $2 million per vessel transiting the strait, per ship, every time. Let that number settle for a moment and think through its implications, because if you understand why this demand is actually on the table, you understand how Iran is negotiating. A $2 million per ship toll on the Strait of Hormuz would be the single most disruptive precedent in the history of international maritime law. The entire architecture of freedom of navigation, the legal framework that has governed the world's oceans for 2 centuries, was specifically constructed to move humanity away from exactly this model. 500 years ago, coastal powers routinely extracted tolls from ships passing near their territories. The British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, great naval empires built partly on controlling maritime choke points and taxing passage through them. The modern international order replaced that system with the principle of free navigation in international waters, and every major trading nation on Earth built its commercial strategy on that foundation. If Iran gets a toll on Hormuz, the question immediately becomes, why not Turkey on the Bosphorus? Why not Denmark through the Baltic approaches? Why not Spain at Gibraltar? The answer that holds the entire system together is that international waters cannot be taxed by whoever happens to border them. The moment that principle is breached, it is breached everywhere, and the reverberations would extend far beyond the Middle East. Iran almost certainly knows this demand will not be accepted in its current form. The purpose of putting it on the table is to create negotiating currency, something extreme enough that trading it away feels like a concession, even though abandoning it costs Iran nothing it actually expected to keep. Classic positional bargaining. Ask for far more than you want, then appear reasonable when you give it up in exchange for something you actually wanted all along, like sanction relief or binding security guarantees. Point 8 ties directly to the toll proposal. Iran wants to split any collected fees with Oman, since both countries share a border on the strait. If point 7 goes, point 8 goes with it. Point 9 would have Iran establish formal rules governing passage through the waterway. essentially asserting traffic control authority over one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. Point 10 frames any compensation mechanism as reconstruction funding, not reparations, a framing distinction that matters politically in Tehran, even if the practical difference is minimal. Trump's public characterization of Iran's proposal was carefully chosen. He described it as a workable basis for negotiation, not an acceptance, not an endorsement, but an acknowledgement that there is enough overlap to keep the conversations moving. Iranian state media attempted to frame this language as full American acceptance of Iran's terms. That characterization is not accurate, and the distinction matters for understanding what the next 2 weeks actually look like. Two unresolved issues tower over everything else and are most likely to determine whether these negotiations survive contact with reality. The first is Iran's ballistic missile program. The American position has shifted from previous administrations. Washington is no longer demanding complete elimination. What the U.S. is now seeking is caps, limits on missile range, restrictions on production and stockpile size, a containment framework rather than disarmament. For Iran, the missile program is not a bargaining chip. It is the one capability that gives them genuine deterrence against vastly superior conventional military forces. Asking them to cap it is asking them to accept a permanent ceiling on the only leverage they believe keeps them safe. The second, and historically more intractable issue, is uranium enrichment. Iran has been enriching uranium to levels that approach weapons-grade material. The United States wants Iran to surrender not just the enriched stockpile, but the underlying capability, the centrifuge infrastructure, the processing facilities, the technical knowledge base. Iran has been consistent for years in its response. Enrichment is a sovereign right, not a bargaining chip, and giving it up would represent a form of permanent strategic surrender they are unwilling to accept. Every negotiation over the Iranian nuclear question for the past 2 decades has eventually found its way to this wall. There is no indication this one will be different unless someone finds a creative middle ground in the next 14 days. One development broke through the noise of all of this in a way that deserves separate attention. An American journalist who had been abducted in Baghdad by an Iranian-backed militia was released, and critically, she was released before the ceasefire was announced. That timing reveals something important. Her recovery was the result of a parallel diplomatic track, running separately from the ceasefire negotiations, likely facilitated primarily through the Iraqi government. Multiple channels were operating simultaneously, with different mediators pulling different levers on different timelines. The fact that one of those tracks delivered results before the main agreement was even finalized suggests the diplomatic ecosystem around this conflict is more active and more complex than the headline story suggests. Iran's foreign minister issued his own statement confirming the ceasefire, and inside that statement was a phrase that deserves careful reading. Safe passage through the strait would be possible with due consideration of technical limitations. Technical limitations. That is the diplomatic vocabulary for sea mines. Iran deployed mines throughout the strait during the conflict, and clearing a minefield is not a matter of issuing an order. It is a slow, methodical, physically dangerous process that takes time and specialized equipment. What Iran is describing is guided passage through pre-cleared corridors while the rest of the waterway remains hazardous. Ships will move in single-file lanes, controlled and slow, with hundreds of vessels queued and waiting. Before this conflict, the full width of the strait accommodated simultaneous bidirectional traffic. What reopens now is a narrow channel, functional but nothing close to normal operating capacity. That matters because the global energy system was already under acute stress before this ceasefire. Multiple countries across Asia and Europe were approaching genuine emergency thresholds in their oil reserves. Power rationing was under active discussion in several major economies. Industrial production was beginning to contract in energy-intensive sectors. The reopening of even a restricted Hormuz corridor provides breathing room, real, measurable relief for economies that were running out of time. But breathing room is not a solution. It is a window, and this one is 14 days wide. If the negotiations inside that window find enough common ground to extend the pause, the world stabilizes incrementally. If they collapse, over missiles, over enrichment, over the questions Lebanon and Israel haven't resolved, over any of the 10 demands that remain unreconciled, the crisis resumes from a position of heightened mutual knowledge. Both sides now understand each other's tolerance for pain, each other's red lines, and exactly how close the other was willing to push before blinking. That knowledge cuts both ways. It makes future negotiations more informed. It also makes future escalation more precisely calibrated. The next 14 days are not a diplomatic formality. They are the countdown that the entire global economy is watching in real time.